Welcome back to another episode of the CSKA podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this week's episode, I'm having a conversation with Roxana Hadad where we discuss blurring of formal and informal learning within makerspaces and culture, how Roxana's understanding of education evolved over time, feeling lost when having too much choice with one's own learning, the intersections of makerspaces and equity, problematizing discourse and definitions around computational thinking and computer science, preventing burnout while working on many different projects, feeling a lack of agency in education, the future of communication for academics, and so much more. As always, you can find links to some of the things that we mentioned, as well as some more related podcast episodes in the show notes, and you can find that at jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, wherever you can find your description. While you're there, you'll notice that this podcast is powered by Boot Up Professional Development, which is the nonprofit that I work for. If you want to learn more about the free curriculum that I create for Scratch and Scratch Junior, check out bootuppd.org, and you can also learn about our paid professional development. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Roxana.
I'm the daughter of Cuban immigrants. I was born and raised in a suburb outside of Chicago, and I was one of very few Latinas in my school. My mom was a bilingual kindergarten Chicago public school teacher for 33 years. My aunts were CPS teachers. My grandma was a school teacher in Cuba. So I was sort of raised in the world of public education. My mom and dad got my brothers and I a computer pretty early on. Say I was like maybe 8 or 10 years old. I mean, early on, before like lots of people had computers in their houses. I subscribed to the magazine 321 Contact. It came with these like programs that you could recreate and adapt in BASIC. And so I was programming in BASIC and I loved doing it. And I did that, mostly in elementary. Middle school, I had some contact with computer science, not that much. And then in high school, there was a class in, I'm trying to remember what language it was. I don't know if it was BASIC or Pascal. And I had a friend try to encourage me to do it with him. And it was all guys. And so I told him, no way. I was totally uninterested in being in a class with all guys. So I spent high school without doing much private programming. I graduated from high school and then I struggled with whether to go to a 4-year or an art school, like a regular 4-year in art school, because I trained as an artist for most of my life. But I decided in the end to go to the University of Illinois at Urbana for undergrad. It was right after the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, developed Eudora and Mosaic to browse the web. And all this stuff is so old. Everyone's going to be like, why do you get such an old person? And so like U of I at that time, like everything was like the internet. Like everybody was so geeked out about the internet because it just was like, it was very new for so many people. And I don't know, it was really an exciting time to be at U of I. And though I left, I didn't go to art school. I really wanted to keep that side of myself. So at U of I started working for departments doing different things, like doing high resolution scanning for the art history department. And I was doing like front end and back end development for the foreign language department, but anything that I could use like design and art stuff, I started doing. After graduation, I started working as a writer for a .com. And I realized I just really liked this technical side of things. I went to NYU's Interactive Telecommunications program at the Tisch School of the Arts for my master's degree. And that let me combine art with technology in a way that I hadn't really imagined before. Like my first contact with physical computing, with makerspaces, game design, that experience was super formative for me. It kind of laid the foundation for a lot of my career henceforth. And probably because I came from a family of educators, I was resistant to doing anything in education. But I kept getting drawn into issues of education while I was at NYU. So after I graduated from NYU, I went to work at Northwestern University at this place called the Collaboratory, which doesn't exist anymore. But it was this super forward-thinking group of programmers that were really into developing. The thing I could maybe compare it to now is something like Schoology, but it was messier and cooler. And it was where kids could post their work and they could reflect on it and others could comment on it all over the world and teachers could comment on it. And it was just a really innovative online space for classrooms. And then while I was there, I was at a Adobe Education Leader Conference and I met Greg Hodgson and Ian Usher. And they saw some of the games I had been programming. At NYU, I had done some game design and they wanted me to teach their kids, but they lived in London. And I wasn't really sure how that was going to happen. And we used Adobe Connect to bring in. So I started designing these classes where I would give a little bit of game theory. I'd bring in a guest speaker on a topic. And then these kids would learn programming to design these games, even though they were like a little bit outside of London and I was in Chicago. That got me super excited about just this idea of what these kids were learning and how they were learning it. And so I learned a little bit about computational thinking. And then I decided to go to the University of Illinois at Chicago to get my PhD in educational psychology, studying computational thinking. And at the same time, I started working at the Center for College Access and Success at Northeastern Illinois University, where I started developing like out of school programming for students in Title I schools in Chicago public schools. They were all part of the Gear Up program, which is this program that serves Title I schools. My job there was like, I was just trying to expose students to ideas of game design, computer science, robotics, just maker stuff. And so I was doing a lot of that work. And at the same time, Irene Lee, who is now at MIT, she asked me to become part of the CSTA's computational thinking task force. And then that started really shaping my thinking around computational thinking. Then around that time, I was still a PhD student and I got an NSF grant, a National Science Foundation grant to study the assessment of computational thinking in maker environments. And that became part of my dissertation. So if you're interested in assessing computational thinking, first, I recommend you read our paper, Formative Assessment for Computational Thinking in Makerspaces. But I think you really have to be creative and think of ways to make thinking visible. Part of the problem with computational thinking is that it's thinking. But good assessment allows you to learn about yourself or about the content while you're doing the assessment. The assessment just doesn't exist just to assess you. So I've had a lot of success in having students do like think alouds where they narrate what they're doing, getting them to identify the process while they're using it, really pushing the metacognitive skills while they're doing these think alouds, and especially when they're debugging and drawing out a problem or writing out a problem has been a really good way for students to make problems more tangible.
And to make the thinking more visible.
Exactly. When that grant ended, I joined the CS Equity Project at UCLA Center X. That's been nothing but an absolute joy. Like working with Jane Margolis, Jean Rue, Julie Flappin, they've just done so much in the field and they've shaped so much of my thinking around what computer science education is and what it should be and ideas of equity. And they're just amazing human beings. I started working there on a research practice partnership called Scale CA that it addresses the systemic nature of computer science education by building the capacity of not just teachers. Generally, a lot of these ideas of equity are focused on teachers, but also including the administrators, policymakers, counselors. Most of my work has been with administrators since then. By administrators, I mean like school leaders, having them explore their own biases and the policies and structures in their institutions that prevent them from helping students get engaged in computer science. Julie calls this kind of like focus on the teachers, admin, and policymakers, the 3 C's, the classroom, the county, and the capital. And we're now expanding into a 4th C, which includes the community. And we have a new employee, Paula Nazario, who is helping us on that. And now, like I do work on CSforCA, our Computer Science for California, which is our statewide movement to expand computer science. Most of my focus now is we just got a large educator workforce investment grant from the state of California to expand the work we've been doing with Scale and Computer Science for California. We're calling it the Seasons of CS. We had this pilot program where we just did a CS PD week, and we want to expand the professional learning of CS PD weeks to teams of counselors, teachers, and administrators. And we're expanding it not just through this idea of who gets it, but across the entire state of California, to expand the work we've been doing with Scale and Computer Science for California. We're calling it the Seasons of CS. We're expanding it from a pilot that was the Summer of CS, which provided professional learning to teams of teachers, counselors, and administrators in a CSPD week model. And we're now expanding this across the state of California through the county offices in every region, and then expanding it throughout the year and building communities of practice to develop folks into what we're calling CS champions, which are like advocates for equitable computer science for all students.
So like Being a musician, I have had a lot of formal and informal experiences that like profoundly impact my thoughts on music education. The way that you just kind of described your background had a lot of informal, non-formal kind of blurred in with formal experiences, obviously getting a doctorate, but then makerspaces, depending on how they are implemented, whether it's during school or after school, can kind of be that like merging together of informal with formal. I'm curious, like, how your experiences in these different contexts have kind of shaped your understandings of, well, what might a makerspace look like, or even what might education look like in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this is the siloing of how education operates currently is definitely a detriment to learning. The way I got into CS was, I described it a little bit, but like really like I drew little characters on a screen and I wanted to make them move and interact with people when, they move their mouse over them. That's essentially how I started learning the program. And I think for other kids, it's, robotics, or it's doing circuitry, or it's doing music. But the way educational systems are set up right now, there's just a lot of this is driven by assessment, right? Like we have to make sure that students learn the certain content area in certain disciplines. Because of that, we draw these lines between things. And that's what I love about makerspaces is I feel like it blurs those lines a little bit and allows for students to connect different parts of their identity in a makerspace. I hope that there's more of these kinds of spaces during the actual school day and not just an after school experience, because that's making it really equitable and having students really engage with their ideas of who they are, how they can engage with that identity in a way that they can create and they can make something that's for them or for their community.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. So for my own dissertation, I was looking at people in an online discussion forum talking about chiptunes, which is music made from like retro computer and video game hardware. And so there's a lot of engineering that goes on, design and manufacturing, to be able to create chips to connect new devices to the old, like a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. But then there's also a lot of programming that goes on. Like it blurs these disciplinary lines and silos that exist in ways that I honestly couldn't find a framework to really describe it well enough until I looked at maker scholarship and was like, okay, so here's people who are talking about informal, non-formal spaces typically. This makes sense, like the way that people are engaging with it, but it's just so different from what actually goes on inside of the classroom. And it was interesting going through this process because it wasn't really until the PhD when I really got a say in what I wanted to learn. And up until then, I was like, well, school works great if you're interested in it. Otherwise, it sucks. But once you finally get up to the PhD level, it's all right, what do you want to learn? What are you interested in? I'm like, now we can actually explore whatever direction I want to go in other than just an elective. And even then, it's still like you chose a topic that you're interested in. We're going down a path that everybody goes in. But this is very different than the way that I actually approached the classroom when I finished doing my residency. I'm curious for you, like, how has your understanding of education kind of evolved or changed over time?
I think two ways. The first way, and so much of this is because of my own personal experience. A lot of the work that I've done at the CS Equity Project and really investigating issues of equity, I think subconsciously I really believed in this idea of meritocracy. I worked really hard in school. Unlike you, I really liked the classroom structure. I had the privilege, coming from a middle-class family. I have light skin. I have blue-gray eyes. I had all of this stuff. And I really believe that due to my hard work in these classrooms, that is how I became successful. And by successful, I mean like I got to go to college. And it sounds super naive now, but I really bought into this idea, I think, of meritocracy. And I think, didn't really recognize the challenges I had faced, like without, that I was identified as female and that I was Latina and that I was first generation natively born, and the structures that I didn't know the ins and outs of. So I think that is one way that the nature of education has changed for me. Mm-hmm. But I think also that this playing the game that I'm talking about in the classroom that I did quite well, I think was also a bit of a detriment Like, and I saw this with some of the students in the makerspaces that I led, that they really struggled with ambivalence, that they had like with open-ended kind of prompts when there isn't a very clear path forward as to connecting with like what you want to do and how to make that happen. I saw myself in a lot of these students where they're like, wait, I can do, what I want. And I would develop prompts for them, but like, within that prompt, they had freedom, and this freedom they struggled with. And I think not all of them, I'm thinking of these specific students with whom I identified with that when placed outside of the regular structure of the school day, they had a hard time.
So I'm curious if we can dive into that more. So when placed out of the structure, may have felt a little like aimless or lost, but did you feel that way, or even your students feel that way when engaging in like non-formal types of learning? Like whether it's like, oh, I want to learn how to do this type of artwork and you're doing it outside of a class. Did you feel like you were lost then?
Martinez and Steger talk about this a lot in their books about makerspaces. It's about a really good prompt, right? Like I luckily had teachers. So when I'm thinking about art, my art classes, my instructors, they would essentially be giving us prompts. Like you have to do something with just pen and ink, black and white, that focuses on, gradients, and it has to be an animal or whatever. And they would place these prompts and I would be able to pick among there. I think when we pushed students to really, and myself, I know this happened to me in grad school. I had my master's degree before I went to PhD. And my master's degree was my first taste of what you were talking about in this kind of graduate school, kind of you lead your education. And for me, it was a bit of a challenge, like really trying to figure out what it is, who I was outside of the structure of the school day, that it wasn't just about answering questions on a test to get an A. It was more about really figuring out your own identity and the path you want to move forward. And I don't think my schooling did a lot of amazing things for me, but I think it could have done more to really help me engage in that way.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot with students. And then I even noticed that with myself, when you are basically socialized for years, sometimes decades, into one way of schooling and learning. Well, schooling, I should say. And then you're being presented the opportunity to do it in a completely different way where you have choice and can explore whatever direction you want to. It can be overwhelming at times and just like, wait, I'm lost. This isn't what I'm used to. Let's go back to the thing that I'm more comfortable with, as opposed to being able to explore things that are interesting to an individual. I'm curious for you, when you were exploring research on makerspaces, what surprised you about it?
Okay, two things. I think the first thing was this research came out of my own, like just observing. And I was noticing with the students, their struggle with this, and like legitimately students like asking me, but what is the answer? Like,
yeah,
they were uncomfortable with me telling them, here are some components for a circuit. You come up with whatever, like configurations of a circuit you want to make with. And they're like, yes, but what do you want me to make? And I like trying to tell them, like, you can make whatever you want. A lot of times this was the high achieving students, but not always. Like, sometimes it wasn't, it was students all along, like, who were successful at playing the school game and some who were not. It was interesting to me to see how different that was. I think in reading about makerspaces, not like necessarily a surprise, but something I hadn't really considered as much before. What was exciting to me about makerspaces was that students could bring not just their own identity, but the identity of their families into a makerspace. So makerspaces then value the kind of learning that their families have in ways that aren't really like in American culture, American society aren't always valued. So, a mechanic or somebody who bakes or somebody who sews, like that's what was exciting about a makerspace to me, is that all of a sudden, like all of this knowledge, these funds of knowledge are then appreciated and tapped into. So we did that with our makerspace. Like we would have show and tell and just have kids, like it didn't have anything with what they were doing in makerspace, but stuff they did at home that completely disassociated, but like was part of who they were. So kids brought in like their tejido, their crochets, the paintings they made. I remember one kid She would make model cars with her dad, who was a mechanic, and she would bring those in just for them to start really thinking about who they were, who their family was, and providing that kind of foundation for where they might want to go with the things that they were making.
So I'm seeing a ton of connections between what you're just describing with makerspaces and then what I know you've talked about and done with your more equity-centered work and whatnot. And like even like, what was it, last night when we were talking about the KPOR framework and applying that, like, I'm curious if you could be more explicit for a teacher who is like unable to make that connection that I see you doing right there with between like makerspaces and then equity related discussions.
What makerspaces allow for is this connection between students' home life and their internal life. And if done in that way, it also with content that like academic learning, and not in a way that you would normally think of academic learning, but it's coming from within them to pursue a project that requires them to then find the sources of their own motivation, to then find solutions to problems they want to answer. Those problems can come from things they are facing, things their communities are facing. And what's exciting about makerspaces is that it's a space, not to be reductive. They connect both online and offline. And you have connections with people who are probably more expert than you and less expert than you. But the interaction between those groups of people really start generating these kinds of ideas that don't normally happen if you are in isolation thinking about these projects. And you also have access to materials, whether that be like just a laptop for you to make like a game or a song or something like that. But sometimes it's like yarn and cardboard tubes or whatever. But the access to materials that make you really be able to prototype and build things that are part of that motivation.
I appreciate the emphasis on the idea of it's a space. Like I've talked about this in previous podcasts on maker culture, maker spaces, but then also on affinity spaces, which are more like informal characteristics and how I applied them into the classroom. Like there is an ontology of being a maker that can be applied outside of maker spaces. So you can apply it in your computer science class or your music class or social studies or whatever. Like it's just a way of being or learning or experiencing that doesn't have to take place in these specific spaces labeled as makerspace that are during school or after school or whatever.
No, absolutely. And I think the other tricky thing with making and makerspaces is the same thing we're kind of up against in the computer science community, which is it has been associated with this cis white guy.
Yeah.
Building these things, who's part of the maker community or part of the CS community, when neither of those spaces, should they claim ownership to. So I think there's just so much overlap between those spaces, which is why I was really interested to see like how could we work on these kind of skills that we build in maker spaces to build identity as a computer scientist in students, regardless of being in a makerspace or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a podcast that I did. It's on an article called Making Through the Lens of Culture and Power Toward Transformative Visions for Educational Equity. And so that talks specifically about how while the maker practices are awesome, the way that it's presented is as if this is a new shiny thing, largely for white males to engage in, but really it's coming from typically blue collar jobs and from marginalized groups. And that is like kind of pushed to the wayside, and it's like, oh, here's this new thing you can do. And it's like, well, actually, there's a long history of professions, people who actually do this, and we can't just ignore them and that history that goes behind that. So I appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, just by slapping the name makerspace on it, like it's not, I remember the first time I described this to a teacher, a makerspace to a teacher, she was like, oh, you're talking about like shop class. And at first I was like, no, it's totally different from shop class. And then after a while I was like, no, actually it's a lot like shop class. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I'm grateful that I had shop class in middle school. Like I learned so many tools. it was a 3-day weekend and I spent most of it like renovating our house, like using a miter saw. It's like, I actually know how to use this thing. Yay.
I don't remember anything from my shop class, so I'm so super impressed with you right now. I made some cool stuff too, but I don't remember how I did it.
Well, in fairness, I did have a refresher. Like after I finished the PhD, did a volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity and learned how to build a house from the like slab up. So like it was like, oh yeah, I forgot this. Like it was a long time ago, but now I remember how to use a miter saw or whatever.
I think too, like what you were talking about in terms of the makerspace, all of a sudden, like, oh, this is makerspace, and now this is a new shiny thing.
Yeah.
I think the same thing could be said of, I think we're in danger of that with computational thinking, where we say, I have my own definition of computational thinking. And if I described what computational thinking is, I think most people would be like, wait, that's critical thinking, or that's mathematical thinking, or that's reasoning, or there's lots of things where they would be like, this has been done before, this is not. And I think that's the danger of both computational thinking and computer science, where we can sometimes think that we're the end all be all.
Yes.
In our community. And I think this is an issue of equity as well. We have to pay attention to the fact that other fields have a lot to offer, and that if understanding computational thinking is the best way to solve problems or the only way to solve problems, then we would have no problems. There's enough computer scientists already, and I think we've figured out by now that like being a computer scientist does not make you better at solving problems. In fact, you might create more. So I think it's how you frame computational thinking too. Like it depends on how you do it. You can use computational thinking for good or for not so good.
Yeah, it has this potential to come across as like colonizing epistemologies and to even frame other entire disciplines as a deficit. Like, hey, arts, you've been doing things for thousands of years. That's nice and all, but have you heard of computational thinking? It's this new thing. And then it's like, ignore your thousands of years of traditions and ways of thinking and understanding. We, as the non-artists, are going to show you what you're supposed to do as artists by thinking computational thing. It's like, wait, what? Like, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, we're super, what is the word? Like just arrogant. We're like in the CS Ed community, we've become incredibly arrogant. And I mean, that's a function of like how pervasive technology's become, right? So it's in everything. So we can say, well, we think we can say like, oh, well, you've got to figure out this like one scratch with this CS Band-Aid. This is what's going to figure it out. And it goes back to what I was saying before, that it's really this integration of disciplines and really understanding how having an understanding of history, having an understanding of ethics, having an understanding of design, all of those things are really important when we are creating any kind of application.
Yeah, and your point about like tech being in everything and like that kind of being used almost as like a platform to stand on for a lot of like advocacy work. Like, yes, it is in everything. However, it was designed and optimized for white and Western cultures. And so if we are positioning this is literally colonizing like ways of being. If we're saying, no, everybody needs to adhere to this and understand this disposition or thinking or whatever.
So my definition of computational thinking, it borrows from Selby and Woolard, who are British researchers. I use them because they kind of did a meta study of definitions of computational thinking. And I also use like the dispositions that ISTE and CSTA had put together. The concepts that Selby and Woolard had put together, as long as you frame those in a way that you situate it in cultural context and you are critical when you are using them. So, when you are doing like evaluation is the one I most often point to, which is one of the concepts of computational thinking. When you are evaluating something, you're not just evaluating it for, is it fast and efficient, but you're evaluating it like in terms of what communities does this benefit? What communities does this harm? How does this impact the environment? How does this impact specific people in their daily lives? So, I mean, that is part of, if you're doing computational thinking in the way it should be done, in my opinion, then, you're not engaging in epistemological colonization. I feel like if you're doing it from a critical lens and understanding the history and culture and values of the communities with which you want to engage.
Yeah, one of the interesting aspects of computational thinking is it's such a vague term, and like everybody, like you mentioned, kind of has their own definition. And on one hand, I've mentioned several times on the podcast, I strongly value multi-perspectival approaches where you look at things from different angles. But when it comes to like not even be able to have the same understanding of a term, it leads to some tricky territories. So I've done some podcasts where I talk about curriculum and how the word integration might mean one thing to one person and then a completely different thing to a different person, whether it's interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, plural. Like there's so many different ways that we can talk about, well, what does this look like? Who does it serve, etc. And then the same thing with computational thinking. So like on one hand, I value it, but on the other hand, it's like, okay, when a district says they want to integrate computational thinking into the classroom, there's so many different variants of that of meanings that maybe the admin means one thing and then a teacher means a different thing, and parents might look at this as a different thing. So I'm curious if you see strength or weakness or somewhere in between with like the vagueness of the term and lack of consensus.
I mean, I think the problem with the words computational and thinking. So like the fact, the computational part is what I talked about before, like how is this different from like critical thinking? How is this just exclusive to a computational way of solving a problem? I think Peter Denning has talked about this before. I think he's onto something when he calls it computational design, where you incorporate the actual doing of computing with the iterative process of design. Like this is the other problem with the word computational thinking, which is the thinking part, because thinking is internal. You can't see thinking. So what is it exactly you're asking students to do when you want them to engage in computational thinking? You want some sort of output, but how are you measuring that? This is where all this definitional confusion is coming from. I think those two words are in themselves are quite vague. I suppose for me, it's become an asset, making sure that education is equity-centered, equity-minded, in that I can use computational thinking as a framing for how to explore problems with an equity lens. Because I can ask folks when they're looking at patterns, I can ask folks, okay, if you're looking at patterns, look at this data on air quality within this community as opposed to other communities. What are the patterns you see? I can also have them, like I said, do evaluations on their software in consideration of how that impacts a community, how that impacts the environment, how that impacts individuals. CT is not always defined. I think there's people who really lean into mostly like the algorithms, devoid of how those algorithms are designed with specific communities in mind. It's more, they think of these things as though they are completely separate from the culture from which they are created. Like you were talking about, all of this technology that's everywhere was developed by cis white men. So, what does it mean then to develop this technology, develop these algorithms with a broader understanding of society in mind when you are developing them?
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can actually dive into that a little bit more, because the way that computational thinking is discussed is typically in relation to solving a problem, like a math problem or something, not necessarily to solving larger equity-related issues. And in fact, computational thinking is often not really discussed in relation to equity problems or just equity in general. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on those intersections more.
Computational thinking to me is where we can bring in the understanding of equity into computer science by exploring these different ideas. So, for instance, if we're talking about algorithms, just being mindful of how you're designing these algorithms and who is designing these algorithms. So, who is creating this? Do they understand their own privilege, their own biases? Are they developing this algorithm within a team? Then, if it's patterns, what kind of patterns are you looking for and where are you looking for them? How are you abstracting those patterns? By abstraction, I mean you are removing information you deem as unimportant. Mm-hmm. You are focusing on the important data. What are the decisions that go into that abstraction as to what is important and what isn't important when you're looking at data? And then evaluation, as I mentioned, is a huge place where I think a lot of these ideas of equity can come into place. Decomposition, I forgot, like breaking down a problem into its different pieces. Just how you break down a problem as to, again, like what you feel is essential to that problem helps design the way that you solve that problem. It's really about focusing on what lens you're using in creating what you think the problem is. And that lens is also useful when developing the solution. I do like to incorporate the dispositions that ISTE and CSTAs, and these are old, these are from like 2011, but I still think they're important because of what I witnessed in the makerspace, this idea of, the discomfort with ambivalence and open-endedness. And this, again, is an equity issue. I really do think these dispositions are important because but I want them to be used appropriately. Like, you should use dispositions to shape what you want the environment to be like for your students. I think we get into danger when we use the dispositions in terms of assessment. Like, does my student have computational thinking skills? And then, can they persevere, right? It's like that whole idea of grit. And when you have students who are facing so much in their lives in terms of racism, misogyny, just systemic oppression, you don't want to approach these dispositions in a way of like, oh, well, you're scoring low on perseverance or anything like that. It's more for the instructor to really think about, like, what environment am I creating to make sure you can encourage these dispositions to take place. I think that's what's important when we're talking about ideas of equity and computational thinking.
How does this conversation kind of relate to or diverge from the UCLA Computer Science Equity Project?
The way it relates in terms of my work, and we have various projects at the CS Equity Project, and my colleague Jean Rue does a lot of work around student voice in computer science education. And so the work that she does definitely applies with what I've just been talking about. But I also do think it applies in the work that I've been doing with Julie Flappin around these more institutional structures, this implementation, like how to implement computer science equitably, in that we want to make sure that we don't just roll out computer science in California in a way that is, for instance, like just say like it's a graduation requirement and everyone needs to take computer science without really considering like what that means. So like what I just discussed in terms of like assessment and culturally responsive pedagogy, if those things aren't in place, then what we're doing is exacerbating the inequities that already exist within the educational system. And what's exciting about computer science, at least in California, is that it's pretty nascent. So we have an opportunity now to carve our own path. And it's a way for us to really, as Julie says, kind of like bake equity in, make sure it's part of the foundation of what we're doing, and really intentionally go and build this path so that when CS, if it is a requirement one day, it's done in a way that students are assessed, if they have to be assessed, in a way that takes in mind who they are and isn't reinforcing biases that are already in place. And that they're getting a computer science education that is culturally responsive, that is important to making sure that we're not, again, just exacerbating these inequities that are already in place.
One of the issues that I've kind of thought out loud on this podcast about is like the different images of curriculum, where some people see curriculum as like discrete subject areas or as content knowledge or as learning specific standards or concepts and practices. But then others view curriculum as social reproduction or social deconstruction, or trying to make improvements, like whether it's deconstructing it and then rebuilding it in like a new way. And so it's more equity focused. And so there's this like butting of heads that happens between the people who tend to lean more towards, no, it should just focus on the content. And then other people who are like, no, it should focus on improving society in some way. And because they're using kind of the same words like computational thinking, but they mean different things, then it's like they're unable to see like, oh, we're actually talking about two separate things, even though we're using the same vocabulary.
So in that scale research practice partnership, one thing we did as a community throughout the research practice partnership was define equity. And we did it at the start of the research practice partnership. We did it about 2 years after that. And then we did it a year after that. Mm-hmm. And this practice of defining it together as a community, it provided us with like this foundational language by which we all knew what we were talking about when we used the word equity, because equity's really gotten watered down lately, right? Like everybody uses that word, but we all could talk about what it meant in the same way. And then, but it also provided like this place for discussion. And it was difficult discussions, like really uncomfortable discussions, but they're discussions that need to be had. And I think providing these kinds of spaces for educators to come together and define these terms like equity, like computational thinking, for the very reasons you're talking about, because it's really difficult for us to all go in a direction together if what we're coming from it from completely different ways. And just this process of us coming together and like defining equity, there was so much dialogue that had taken place to really understand where other people were coming from. It really solidified us as a group, I feel like, because we had this shared understanding and also because we had these conversations with one another.
I really appreciate you saying that. I think it recently came out. There was an episode I did on an article by Proctor where they were talking about how like they had different definitions of computer science. And when they're talking about how to implement across K-12 in a district, like they were talking about the same thing in different ways and they didn't realize that. So it would have helped to define it. So totally agree with you. Like it makes sense. I just wish like politicians and like people in society would sit down and talk about, well, what do these terms mean, instead of just like using buzzwords and throwing memes around that just upset other groups of people.
Yeah, none of these things are terms I think that we can just define it and walk away. Like they are living words. And this is why we defined equity in 2019. Before COVID, before the murder of George Floyd, before the insurrection. So, defining it after that and then defining it again. And I think there's been a lot of changes, like Roe v. Wade and stuff like that are going to make us rethink how we define equity one more time. These are terms that you have to define and redefine because we are approaching these words very differently. Especially the word equity, which has become kind of this like almost nothing word because everyone's using it in totally different ways.
Yeah. And I think that's a part of like Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the press that is often misunderstood or not thought about enough, is like there is that dialogue between oppressor and oppressed, but it's a continuous dialogue that you need to keep revisiting it. It's not like, all right, we had our discussion and everything's solved. Cool. We can move on and never have to come back to this problem again.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what equity work is, right? Like there's never going to be a time when we're like, well, everything's equitable. Like it's done now. Like, I mean, obviously there's goals and there's outcomes. Like we want that outcome where, you can't tell who took computer science from their demographics. That is definitely something where we want to reach, but it's really about the process. It's really about like looking at where these gaps exist and what are we doing that is causing these equity gaps? Where are the problems? Because there's always going to be an equity gap. There's never going to be complete. So it is always this process of looking at the data, analyzing where we are and figuring out where we want to go.
A quick short story. So one day when I was in high school, I was speaking to my band director and I was like, oh, what'd you do this weekend? He's like, oh, I did some renovation work around the house. And I was like, oh, that must have been pretty boring. And he's like, oh, no, actually, I really enjoy it because I'm able to see the results instantaneously. When I throw the paint on the wall, I can see the result and then it's done. And what he said is it differs significantly from teaching band, where it sometimes takes several years before the thing that you are working on all of a sudden makes an improvement, like over time when it comes to performance and whatnot. And so he actually really liked working on those little things because it can be difficult to see how your efforts are going to pay off way down the road. Now, the same thing can happen with equity work in terms of like, you can't see this like instantaneous and we're done, brush it off, just like through the paint on the wall and you never have to come back to it. Well, when it comes to the equity work though, it can be really draining because there is not that resolution and it just kind of keeps going. So long-winded way of getting to this question, which is how do you prevent yourself from like burning out when there's so many demands just on being an educator and a researcher. And then like, especially with working on equity work, which can be draining at times because it does never end.
I do think there's little wins that I can focus on. And that could be just a discussion with a school leader. It could just be, an uptick on one data point or something. You really have to celebrate the tiny wins because they're tiny and they will be tiny, but like they are big for some kid somewhere. So those are the things that you really have to focus on. In addition, like I make sure to work out like every day, and I try to work out as hard as possible to get all the stress and anxiety out. I meditate, I play with my kids, I try to go on hikes. It is draining work. One of the concerns I have is like what I see happening to school leaders is that they feel like they don't have agency, that, they're just a cog in the machine kind of thing sometimes, because they are part of a system that can perpetuate oppression and they sort of don't feel like they have the ability to make changes. That is what happens when you focus on the bigger picture only and like, oh my God, we're not making big gains. But, I specifically remember like this one kid in my makerspace saying like, oh, I know I want to go to college and I know I want to do computer science now. Like that kid was maybe 15 years ago, but I still remember him because I'm like, that was a difference for that one kid. That was like that one kid, like you have to find your meaning. And for me, that was like meaning. And it's not like because I feel like all kids should major in computer science and go to college. It's more that I helped that kid find his path. And, he's a Latino. He was somebody who wasn't one of the represented students. So really focusing on, those tiny little wins are the only way that I think we're going to survive doing this equity work constantly.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I am privileged in that, like the content that I create, that's freely available, like whether it's the lesson plans that boot up or this podcast or whatever, like it can spread to a lot of people and have potential impact. But I don't see that impact because I'm not in the classroom and I don't hear teachers respond. It wasn't until CSTA National this summer where like people were like, hey, I recognize your voice. And, like I listen to your podcast. I'm like, whoa, people listen? Like I don't know, because it doesn't feel like I get that immediate responses like when I worked in the classroom. And when I was working one-on-one with a kid, you could see that like engagement and whatnot. So it's a different kind of work.
I feel bad, Jared. Like I listen to your podcast and I don't ever like, I think maybe once. And it was because it was a paper that like we had written. But like, I mean, they're all so good. So I'll be sure to remember to like call you out on Twitter. So you get that little win, that little bit of endorphin.
Somebody listened.
Somebody listened.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a weird, like this last year, I started like sharing gaming and drumming stuff like on my YouTube channel and whatnot. That has been weird as well because like I'm at almost 1 million views now. And it's like, it doesn't feel like there's hundreds of thousands of people who have engaged with my content, but there has been, which is neat.
I mean, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So that is something I want to learn more from you about. So I talked about the ways that like, I work out, I hike. I have my art background, but it has been so hard for me to really get back into that. Like my life has really been just really like computer science work and family. And I've just been so impressed with how you do the drumming, the gaming, the CS educations, like stuff. And you still read research. How do you do that?
Well, part of it is not having children. So that makes it so I have a lot more time than my peers.
Sure.
That's like a huge, like one of the number one things. My wife is also a very busy type A individual, and I mean that in the best way possible. So because we're both so busy, like we do schedule in time for each other. And then outside of that, I'm planning on gaming on like Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday evenings with one of my friends who's across the country. Like I try and make sure I do that. And like with the music side of things, it's the same thing. Like on Saturdays and Sundays, I try and stream in the morning, and it holds me accountable because now I'm going to practice publicly. Like it's making it so that I am almost being like forced to do that. Like with the podcast, when I do the Unpacking Scholarship episodes, one of the reasons why I do that is because if I don't have a guest lined up, cool, I can just release an episode on my own. It's not reliant on anyone, don't have to put pressure, etc. But the other reason why is it forces me to stay on top of like recent research and to just keep learning and reading, because otherwise I'll find something else to do because there's always a billion things to do. But when it comes down to it, like one of the things that I really learned in the last 2 years in particular, like during COVID, is I need to have a clearer separation between what I do in my 40-hour work week and what I do in my leisure. And so I'm trying to have very distinct start and end points for that. And so like in the mornings, like I'll do workouts like you were saying, but then like, let's say I start at 8 o'clock, work an 8-hour day. I will then do cardio at the end of the day to kind of put like a cap on that and say, now I'm done for the day. Now I'm going to focus on doing other stuff like video editing for the gaming content, or like playing video games or hanging out with my wife or whatever. So having that separation has helped, because I am the kind of person who won't stop working. I'm technically, even though it's like leisure, I'm working on gaming and drumming stuff and putting out social media content like a lot. But I previously would only do computer science stuff nonstop. But because now I'm doing multiple things, it keeps it fresh. So when I come back to the CS stuff, like I'm like, oh, this is something different and new that I wasn't doing on the weekend. And then when it's on the weekend or the weeknight, I'm like, oh, now I get to work on this other thing.
Some of the challenges, like now, I love working from home, but I do think it's making it challenging for me to like make hard stops as to when work time is and when not work time is.
Yeah. One of the things that I also did was I actually had the office in a separate location from my leisure. And so when I'd go into that office, this is privilege of having the space for that, then it was work mode. And when I exited the office, I would shut the door and I'm done for the day or the weekend or whatever. And I would not focus on that. Now I've kind of put myself into a little bit of a pickle in that like there's 2 drum sets in here and a marimba, and like this is where I make music and have fun. This is also where I game, but it's also where I work. So I try and like do my best to make sure that like I am still mentally separating those, and I'm not thinking about work outside of it, and I'm not thinking about like drumming and gaming when I'm working, etc. But sometimes easier said than done.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I don't know if I can do that, but I can try.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned though, with working out, but also the meditation side of things, like that has helped to try and refocus thoughts. Whether it's like, I'm going to do a gratitude meditation. So for 20 minutes, I'm just going to focus on things I'm grateful for, or focus on an object like my dog and just like petting her, or just like even just sitting outside and looking at the birds who are like eating from the bird feeder. Like that kind of attention training almost has been really helpful for being able to focus my mind on work or focus my mind on leisure and being intentional in that moment.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, I am such an avid meditator. I wonder what a mess I would be without it. Like, has this, like, I mean, like, because I feel like my mind is chaos, like, with it. So maybe, I don't know, it probably has helped me in ways that I don't see.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't do any of it until I went to a therapist, because I was on the edge of suicidality, and in like high school and undergrad, I was suicidal for the majority of that period of time. And when I went to a therapist, she had me start doing yoga, and I did it an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. And I did that every single day for weeks, and like just to feel the change in my body and whatnot. Like I know what the before and the after is like. And so I try to be very intentional about working out, about getting my sleep, about eating healthy, about meditating, because I know where it will take me when I don't do that kind of stuff. And so I'm extremely grateful, even though, like you're saying, like, even though I do all these things, like I still get stressed out, etc. But I know I'd be in a much worse place if I didn't do all of these things.
Yeah, totally. No, it's so important for me to do every day. And it's not a good day when I don't do those things.
Yep.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I guess kind of like building off of that, how do you practice or iterate on your own abilities? Like whether it's in research as an educator or even just in leisure. I'm a bit of a practice nerd, so that's why I ask.
What do you mean you're a practice nerd?
Like I took a kinesiology, sports psychology class because I'm interested in like the art of like improvement, whether it's self-improvement or practicing. And so I'm like constantly trying to figure out ways to refine either my drumming or my gaming or even my work, and like how to iterate on that.
I mean, in terms of my work, I work closely with really experienced people, Julie, Jean, and Jane, looking at the way that they work, I've learned a lot from them. The interaction with my partners that are in county offices has also done that. This is hearkening back to my love of school and the school structure. I need to take classes once in a while. I've recently took the Nikki Washington's Cultural Competence in Computing course. I've taken UT Austin's on equity-minded computer science implementation. One way I have gotten myself to do my art is when I take art classes. So because it exposes me, it makes me read stuff, it makes me listen to things, and it makes me really reflect on my own practice in a way that I really struggle to do on my own.
Yeah, that accountability.
Yeah, it's the accountability.
Yeah, my wife started seeing a personal trainer, in a group context kind of thing. And that for her has been to hold her accountable, to make sure she's consistent with it. And same thing for me. When I would go to classes, like you're saying, it makes it so much easier to stay on track, basically.
I'm a total dork for the apps that track stuff. I do Peloton, and it totally works for me, where I'm, this is how many minutes I've worked out this year, and I want to make sure I meet this amount of minutes by the end of the year. And that also really helps. Is just, I hate to be this cheesy, but the SMART goals really do help in making me achieve things.
Yeah, I mean, I do morning and evening reflections, and I track quantitative and qualitative data, and mark, here's my level of anxiety right now, and here's how much sleep I got, and I do quarterly reflections where I go back and review that data, and I've done it now for almost 3 years. I did it the other weekend, and when I was watching all the videos the other weekend, I was like, man, I've improved 20% on this, or etc. It's really cool to see that. And I wouldn't have known that if it was probably a month ago I met with my therapist. I was like, yeah, I feel like I haven't been doing great. But then when I actually looked at the data, and I'm like, oh wait, this is way better than it was 2 years ago. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, I love that you do that. That's so awesome. And I really should incorporate evening meditation too, because I only do morning, but it's nerd stuff, but it really does help me be accountable in ways just that not doing it would not do.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a bit of an extreme, but it works for me, and I'm happier as a result.
It's a bit of an extreme, but I love that it works for you.
Yeah, there's a podcast and a book called 10% Happier, and it talks about meditation. It's by Dan Harris, which is not to be confused with Sam Harris, who also does meditation stuff and a bunch of other things. But yeah, if I can get 10% happier doing this morning and evening reflection, sure, I'll do it.
10%'s a big percent. That's a lot of percent.
Yeah, I'll take it. I'm curious, if we think of the field as a whole, there are a lot of issues in education going on. I'm curious, what's something that you feel is holding back the field or educators? And then if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do to kind of fix that?
It's a little bit of what I talked about before. The educators feel like they have a lack of agency at the moment, and there's a lot of burnout.
Yeah.
And it's totally understandable that this stuff is going on, because there is so much that is out of their control. And the political environment has made the day-to-day life of educators at times a bit of a minefield. So it's, the magic wand, I think this does go back to what I was talking about before, is the coming together. It sounds strange, but I do think the coming together and the defining of terms, the coming together and talking about what do you mean when you're saying you want the best for your kid? Having that conversation with school leaders and teachers and parents. And really, I think there's just such a lack of dialogue that is leading to this real chasm that, educators they aren't appreciated for the work that they do. And I think if people understood what their day-to-day was there would be way more understanding in terms of just recognizing how difficult their job is and what they're doing. I think that people understanding the decisions that administrators have to make, and for folks to understand what parents go through, and what their lives at home are and the different struggles that they're experiencing. We're not in community. And I think these dialogues are what could really help in terms of really making people feel that we're in this together. And I think that would like in some ways help with the burnout, just because I think we would lend a lot more grace to people. And I would also hope that the dialogue would also kind of change this idea of hierarchy that exists within educational structures that makes decision making come more from just more of a community-based kind of decision making, but one that hears the voices of those who you don't normally hear from, not just the loudest ones.
So in May of 2020, there was this moment where I felt like there was actually going to be a shift in discourse around educators, because I started seeing parents on social media be like, I get it. My kid is difficult to work with. You're right. They are really hard to teach. And this was because like parents were having to teach their kids in like April and May of 2020. And then over the summer, it shifted back to teachers are babysitters. Why aren't you back in classrooms, etc.? Your health is not as important as me being able to go to work. And it was really kind of disheartening to see that like profound shift happen for the positive and then just immediately get probably worse than it was in terms of how society in general kind of viewed and talked about educators and their role or importance.
I mean, I think that it's a reflection on the lack of social safety net we have in place for anyone, whether that be a parent or it be a teacher. We want to blame somebody when in general it's the system, but we want to be able to point our finger at a thing, at a person, and say, you know, it is your fault that I am going through this. It's a lot easier than dismantling a system that is put in place. And by a system like capitalism, like you're not going to dismantle capitalism. So it's a lot easier to say, this is my kid's teacher's fault. They aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And I think this has been, it's no surprise, like the last 3 years have been just really challenging for everyone. And I think that's why, you know, politics have gotten this the way it has, why what you're talking about in terms of, you know, this dialogue around teachers, it's a lot of this wanting to find, you know, a tangible thing that we can blame when it's the system in which we exist. And, you know, we're the fish in the water. It's really hard for us to see outside of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And it's kind of like a through line in the conversation. Like parents, students feel a lack of agency when it comes to the educational system. But then your point about administrators feeling that, which is fascinating because like teachers view the administrators as like the people with all the power. But then the admin are like, I have no power. I have no agency. But then like even higher up, like politicians are like, but I want to get things done, but I can't because of A, B, and C. Like it just seems like a profound lack of agency or all around.
Yeah, we all kind of feel like our hands are tied in some way. A lot of it, I would argue, comes back to capitalism, is why our hands are tied in lots of ways. It's a system that really limits the ways that we can move because we are constrained by generating wealth for a small section of the population.
Yeah. Henry Giroux, what do you know? Education's not a social good. It's all about pleasing the stakeholders. Come on, or the shareholders.
That's totally it. That's totally it.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, no. And I think, you know, in the way that we talk about it now, like that is the subtext to a lot of our conversations of education is all around that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think computer science as a whole in the K-12 like really can be borderline problematic when it comes to that. Like it's so, I don't know, in bed with corporate culture and like fulfilling corporate needs. Like the most common argument for, well, why should we have K-12 CS? Well, there's all these open jobs. And it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a problem if you feel that that's the only need for computer science at this point.
Right. It's such a tricky thing. And I mean, as someone who, you know, full disclosure, has taken money from these large tech companies in order to do my research, it is such a complicating factor in what we do. And I think we as a CS education community have to really think about what our purpose is when we're doing this. You know, it is also tricky when we're talking about equity because we can say like, look, it's these jobs and they're high paying jobs and it's Black and brown students, low income students, rural students can have access to these kinds of jobs and they would have high income potential and change the trajectory of their financial lives. So it's very easy for us to get tracked into that. I think what's important is for us to go back to that idea of like how pervasive technology has become and think about it beyond just jobs, but really like, wait, this is how I communicate with people. Is it letting me communicate with them in a way that is healthy for me and for my family? This is how I go shopping. Is this really the way that I really want to be thinking about purchasing goods and stuff? I just went back to capitalism. See how like tied in is, but like it's now really impacted democracy and the way that democracy works, right? So I think that is the way that we really have to think of CS education beyond the sphere of what happens on the economic plane and really how it's impacting us on the social plane, on the communal plane.
Yeah, and there's the layers of impact too. So your point about like, if somebody's in a low socioeconomic status and they're able to get CS education and like potentially bump up into a higher one, like almost immediately upon graduation, that's fantastic. If I reflect on the conversation that I had with Kimberly Scott and like a paper that she wrote with another author who's escaping me, where they talk about how like CS and tech culture is almost a form of sharecropping. And so like how, yeah, you get into a high paying job that is going to be abusive to you. Then it's like, well, is it really that much of an improvement? And so it's like, it's important to look at those different layers and like that level of impact that it has in each of those layers.
Yeah. And I think like Kamal Bob has talked about it as like technology ghettos and like what jobs are these Black and Indigenous students getting? Are they getting, just these low level programming jobs that yes, provide them with money, but then like you said, is it like a new form of sharecropping that like, it's the cis white male at the top that is leading the direction of where this programming is going?
Curious, do you have anything that you're currently working on that you could use some help with, like a listener might be able to assist with?
It's nothing I think anyone can help me with. But
okay.
And this is a problem that Julie and I have been like talking about since forever. But the data that we have is so limiting that we really don't know not just who is taking computer science, but who is teaching computer science and what kind of education have they had. Like, how have they trained to be a computer science teacher? I mean, if someone listening to this can solve that problem, they should definitely contact me. But, we're just not collecting that data. And I do think that's going to be incredibly useful to us in understanding who is getting the computer science education and what kind of education in computer science are they getting, and really understanding how teachers are understanding what computer science is, what computational thinking is, and how they implement that in the classroom. We have a lot of qualitative small scale studies, but there's just no large set of data that can really tell us for California statewide or even nationally, like what that landscape looks like.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. My guess is most teachers are in service already and are starting to learn CS just based off of what I'm seeing with Boot Up. But it would be really interesting to do like a survey, get open-ended responses, but then like use corpus linguistics techniques to actually look at, well, what are the patterns of discourse across like the different types of backgrounds and see like what emerges from that. That would be a fascinating study to take a look at.
It would be really, really cool and incredibly useful and probably super expensive, but
yeah, such as research.
Such as research.
Do you have any questions for myself or the field?
My big question for you is like, how do you do all this stuff? As someone from the outside being like, oh my God, like, how does Jared get all that done? Because, I really want to, like I said, engage in other parts of, my art and stuff like that. But it has been such a challenge. But I think I can draw clearer boundaries maybe than I have been doing. So
yeah, and find ways to combine things when possible. Like I said, like not having kids makes so I have a lot more time. But this morning I did upper body workout, and I was in this room doing the upper body workout while I was reviewing a stream that I did previously at 3 times speed. And I would walk over to my keyboard and press M on it to put a marker into Premiere. So that way I would know, oh, this is a clip that I want to use. And then I'd go back to working out. And so I was able to get through like 3 hours worth of content in my hour-long workout. And so it was combining the two things into one. So that is another way that I will do that as well. Like when I'm sharing social media posts, like for like the upcoming week, which I usually do like on Tuesday evenings, I'm reviewing videos on one screen while I'm like just dragging and dropping the files into the social media scheduler. So I'm doing two things at once. It doesn't take any like thought to like, oh, I'm just assigning it into this and then dragging it into this, like, and I can review stuff while I'm doing that. That makes it so that I have more time to do the edits and things like that. So like finding combinations certainly makes my life so that I can get more done in the same amount of time if I had like done it separately, if that makes sense.
I mean, I don't think I could work out and do anything at the same time. That's amazing to me. I have done this and it's been successful. I should do more of it, which is drawing with my kids. And at the same time, like we're all drawing and I get to practice my art at the same time. So, that's a really good example of something I should maybe practice more of is, yeah. This is one of the things I'm grateful to you for is doing these podcasts around papers because I don't have time to read papers anymore. But like more people should do the Jared O'Leary so I can listen to a paper while I'm like doing the dishes or folding laundry.
Honestly, I see that as a future for a lot of scholars and like a really potentially lucrative one. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist at Stanford. And so like he has his full professorship responsibilities, but outside of that, he does a podcast. And I think it's called the Huberman Lab podcast. And he's got over 1 million subs on YouTube for that podcast. So like he's potentially making 6-figure kind of income just doing that podcast where he basically will either interview a guest like I do, or he will like synthesize, like do a meta review of here's what the scholarship says about sleep, or here's what the scholarship says about like digestive tract, etc. And like having listened to it, I'm like, oh, this is what I've been doing, except like I tend to focus on like one paper per episode, and like he'll do multiple within a particular theme, whereas I'll do it like released over multiple weeks. And so like I honestly see more of this style of communication becoming more popular down the road, because I had a chapter that I wrote for like an Oxford or Routledge handbook, and from when I submitted the first draft to when I actually got a like book in hand, it was 3 years. Whereas like if I record a podcast episode today, I can release it this afternoon. Like it's so much easier to have that like really quick kind of response to things that like a traditional publishing route, it just doesn't.
That's a really good point. I mean, I look forward to these days, like where it would be that fast. When it is research, I am reading, it's 2 years after the fact. A lot of times, like you said, 3 years after the fact. And like so much other research has happened since then.
Yeah.
I look forward to that time. And it's just so much easier to consume than reading a paper, at least for people like me who are busy parents.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm a huge fan of podcasts. I see this being a good future direction. We just have to figure out how to do it in a way that is helpful. And so I've been attempting to do that.
You've been doing great at it. I really appreciate it. And thanks so much for the work that you do, because it is helpful for folks like me who cannot sit down and read a paper.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Was there anything you wish that I know it was a while ago, but the paper that I did an episode on that you helped write, like, was there anything you're like, oh, I wish Jared would have talked about this more or this less?
This paper is a lot of the work that we've done around school administrators in implementation issues in terms of like equitable computer science education. One of the things you said was maybe it's not what we're striving for that's the problem, but how we're doing it. So like the problem not being, and this goes back to our conversation before, like this kind of outcomes driven approach to equity in education. It's not that outcomes aren't important. Like they're what give us direction. But the process in which we engage in this work is just as, if not more important, that you have to ensure that equity, like it's not just part of like what you're aiming towards, but that when we're doing this work with administrators, that administrators don't feel like, there's some sort of distinction between researchers and themselves, or that when we're doing work with parents and community, that there is, again, that they feel like there's some sort of hierarchy between the researcher or the administrator and the parent. A lot of this work is us understanding, like doing the work, the difficult internal work we have to do, the work of dialogue, which is also really difficult. So it's not just this like, oh, now we've got the right percentages of kids taking computer science, that path on which we get there is just as important, if not more, in building up what it means to do equitable computer science education. It is us walking the walk that we're talking about doing.
Yeah, and I think beginning that dialogue with like shared definitions and conversations and whatnot, I think that really helps set the tone in a conversational way rather than an attacking, like, you're doing things not my way, you need to do things my way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there is always that kind of divide between the researcher and the practitioner, the parent and the practitioner. Like those are always going to be in place because of the roles that each takes on. But it is through dialogue that I think we can make those differences a little bit smaller.
Yeah, because like, especially when it comes to equity work, totally on board. But like how we say it and when we say it can have a huge impact on whether or not somebody will choose to engage with us.
Absolutely. And this is something I'm learning. Like, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on this. Like, this is something I am learning every day. And back to your question about like, how do you practice on this stuff? I am not a fan of uncomfortable conversations. I really hate conflict. So equity work is really challenging for me because of it, because I do struggle in those kinds of conversations. But it is like constant practice, and it's stretching yourself a little bit beyond what your comfort zone is in order to really get meaningful dialogue with someone else.
Are there any questions that I haven't asked that you want to talk about?
You asked me, like, how has your work on equity-centered teaching and learning informed your understanding of computational thinking in schools? Mm-hmm. I think if we overlap these ideas of equity-centered teaching with computational thinking, I'm hoping, my intention is that this ethos that exists, at least in Silicon Valley, of like move fast and break things, that we can kind of shift that to like, let's move slowly and like more thoughtfully and iterate constantly. I mean, that's not catchy, like move fast and break things, but like move slowly, thoughtfully, and iterate constantly is not going to become a catchphrase. But I do think like really thinking about computational thinking with this equity lens, and we start doing that in schools, is really going to shift how we develop digital tools in thinking like, what am I making? For whom am I making it? Who does it benefit? Who does it harm?
Yeah, it's not as catchy, but maybe if we turn it into a song.
No, I'm working on it. Let's workshop it. It's, yeah.
Yeah, make it into a little TikTok musical. And
I'll do a dance to it. And yeah.
Yeah, it helps the algorithm. Where might people go to connect with you and the organizations you work with?
I'm on Twitter at rhadad. That's at RHADAD. And I'm on LinkedIn at RHADAD. You should check out the CS Equity Project, and you should check out CSforCA, Computer Science for California. Got a lot of resources that are not just for Californians at CSforCA.org or at CSforCA on Twitter.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSKA podcast. Friendly reminder, you can find links to many of the resources that we mentioned, as well as other related podcasts in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. But I really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a rating or review on whatever app that you're listening to this on. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.